Rain battered the empty interstate so violently that Caleb could barely see the faded lane markings ahead of his truck. Every few seconds, lightning flashed across the clouds and illuminated endless walls of black pine trees surrounding the highway. His GPS suddenly crackled with sharp static before a cold mechanical voice ordered him to take the next exit immediately. Caleb frowned and leaned closer to the glowing screen mounted beside the dashboard. The device displayed a route he had never entered, leading toward a rest stop hidden somewhere beyond the forest ahead. A strange pressure tightened in his chest, while the robotic voice calmly repeated the directions again. He had driven freight routes across the country for nearly 12 years without incident. Storms, accidents, and lonely highways had stopped bothering him a long time ago. Yet something about that voice made the back of his neck feel cold. The truck rolled down the isolated exit ramp, while thick fog swallowed the interstate behind him. Caleb glanced into his side mirror and felt uneasy when the highway lights completely disappeared within seconds. It was as though the road behind him no longer existed. Rainwater flooded the cracked pavement, leading toward the rest stop hidden among the trees. Half the parking lot lights flickered weakly, while the others remained completely dead. Dark patches stretched across the pavement like pools of moving shadow. A faded wooden sign stood near the entrance, covered in peeling paint and moss. No name appeared on the board, only a strange circular symbol carved deeply into the wood. Caleb could not explain why the symbol looked disturbingly familiar. Two rusted vehicles sat abandoned near the building beneath sheets of rain. Their windows were fogged heavily from the inside, despite looking untouched for years. Caleb slowed the truck when he thought he saw movement behind the cracked rear window of one car. He quickly parked and stepped outside into freezing rain that instantly soaked through his jacket. The air carried a damp, rotten smell like wet soil freshly dug from a graveyard. Somewhere deep inside the forest, a long, mournful cry echoed between the trees. Caleb forced himself toward the building, while thunder shook the sky overhead. The rest stop looked ancient beneath the flickering fluorescent lights mounted above the entrance. Cracks spread across the brick walls like dark veins. Inside, the silence felt unnatural compared to the violent storm outside. Old travel brochures curled with moisture on dusty shelves, while vending machines buzzed loudly in the corner. Caleb noticed every clock hanging on the wall had stopped at exactly 12:14. A woman wearing a soaked grey raincoat sat alone beside the coffee machine. Her pale face looked exhausted beneath the weak lights, and dark circles hung beneath her eyes. She stared directly at Caleb the moment he entered. "So you followed the route too?" she whispered softly without looking away from him. Her voice trembled slightly as though she had been terrified for a very long time. Caleb laughed uneasily and asked her what she meant. The woman ignored the question and glanced nervously toward the rain-covered windows instead. Caleb noticed her hands were shaking badly while she gripped a paper coffee cup between pale fingers. The fluorescent lights above them flickered hard enough to briefly dim the room. Then the GPS inside Caleb's truck suddenly began speaking through the storm outside. Its distorted voice repeated the same sentence again and again in a calm, mechanical tone. "Route recalculating. Continue to Forest Access Road." A deep shiver crawled down Caleb's spine despite his attempt to stay calm. He joked that the device must be malfunctioning because of the weather outside. The woman suddenly grabbed his wrist with icy fingers before he could step away. Her frightened eyes locked onto his, while rain hammered the windows behind her. She warned him never to follow the GPS after midnight because the road inside the forest never lets travelers return. Caleb pulled his hand free slowly, unsettled by the desperation in her voice. The lights overhead flickered violently again and briefly plunged the room into darkness. For a split second, the windows turned completely black, as though the parking lot had vanished outside. When the light steadied again, one of the abandoned cars had somehow moved closer to the entrance. Caleb stared through the glass while uneasiness twisted deeper inside him. He could have sworn the vehicle had been parked several spaces farther away earlier. The woman lowered her eyes and quietly whispered that the forest was waking up. Trying to convince himself exhaustion was making him paranoid, Caleb bought stale coffee from the vending machine. He headed back toward the truck while the woman silently watched from beside the coffee machine. Just before he opened the driver's door, The GPS screen suddenly lit up bright red. A single message glowed across the cracked display in pulsing letters. "Don't turn back now." Caleb froze beneath the storm while thunder rolled across the forest overhead. Somewhere among the trees beyond the parking lot, something screamed. The truck's engine groaned heavily as Caleb climbed back into the driver's seat. Rain hammered the windshield hard enough to blur the rest stop outside into distorted shapes and shadows. He glanced toward the building one final time and realized the woman in the grey coat had vanished. Only flickering fluorescent lights remained visible through the storm. Caleb locked the doors automatically, while an uneasy silence filled the truck cabin around him. The GPS screen pulsed dimly beside the steering wheel like a living heartbeat. He grabbed the device and pressed the power button repeatedly. Nothing happened except another burst of static spilling through the speakers. The map slowly zoomed toward a narrow road hidden somewhere beyond the interstate. "Proceed to Forest Access Road in 2 miles, the mechanical voice whispered calmly. Caleb muttered curses beneath his breath and forced the truck back onto the empty highway. Fog swallowed the road ahead, while lightning flashed silently above the trees. The farther he drove, the worse the weather became around him. Rain poured so heavily that the world beyond his headlights disappeared completely at times. Every few seconds, the GPS repeated the same instruction in a colder and more distorted tone. A rusted green highway sign eventually emerged through the fog beside the road. Most of the lettering had faded beneath years of rain and corrosion. Caleb could barely make out the words "Blackwood Forest Route" beneath peeling paint. Something about the name filled him with immediate dread he could not explain. Static suddenly exploded through the truck radio with a painful screech that made him jump. Dozens of whispering voices spilled through the speakers at once. Caleb turned the radio dial, rapidly searching for another station. Every channel carried the same desperate murmuring, layered beneath bursts of static. Some voices sounded terrified, while others whispered too quietly to understand. Then a woman's voice suddenly rose clearly above the others. "If you hear this, don't follow the road into the trees," she cried in panic, before the signal dissolved into screaming static. Caleb stared at the radio, while icy sweat formed along his neck. The GPS abruptly rerouted itself and ordered him to take the next exit immediately. Before Caleb could ignore it, the truck headlights flickered violently, as though the battery were failing. A second later, the engine began sputtering hard enough to shake the steering wheel. Fear slowly gnawed at him while the truck rolled toward another isolated exit ramp. The sign above it simply read, "Forest Access," in faded white letters, stained dark by rainwater. Against his better judgment, Caleb guided the truck down the ramp. The pavement narrowed into a lonely 2-lane road surrounded by towering pine trees. Their branches twisted overhead like skeletal claws, blocking almost all moonlight from reaching the ground. Caleb checked his phone and realized he had completely lost signal. Minutes passed while the forest grew denser around him. Strange shapes occasionally moved between the trees beyond the reach of his headlights before vanishing again. The whispering voices from the radio slowly returned, sounding closer and more excited. Then Caleb saw a figure standing motionless in the middle of the road ahead. The person wore a grey raincoat, identical to the woman from the rest stop. She silently pointed deeper into the darkness between the trees. Caleb slammed the brakes hard enough to send the truck skidding across wet pavement. The headlights cut through sheets of rain, but the woman had completely disappeared. Only endless forest remained swaying slowly in the darkness. His heart pounded violently while he stared through the windshield. The GPS screen flickered with broken symbols and distorted lines instead of roads. A pulsing red dot glowed alone inside a black void. A strange electronic hum vibrated through the dashboard like machinery buried underground. Caleb shifted the truck into reverse and backed away from the empty road ahead. Every instinct screamed at him to escape before something terrible revealed itself. After several minutes of driving, he spotted a rusted road sign leaning sideways among the trees. The faded lettering read, "Mile 7, above a jagged bullet hole in the metal. Relief briefly washed over him because he remembered passing the sign earlier. Then he realized the bullet hole looked exactly the same as before. Even the claw-shaped scratch near the bottom matched perfectly. Caleb slowed the truck while cold dread crept through his chest. He continued driving through endless rows of towering pines, dripping with rainwater and moss. Several minutes later, the same Mile 7 sign appeared again beside the road. Caleb stared at it in disbelief. This time he stopped completely and stepped outside into freezing rain. Mud squished beneath his boots while he approached the rusted sign carefully. Fresh fingerprints suddenly became visible in the wet metal, as though someone had touched it moments earlier. A branch snapped loudly somewhere among the trees behind him. Caleb spun around quickly, but the forest stood silent except for rain striking leaves overhead. For a brief second, he thought he saw pale human faces watching from between the trunks. He hurried back into the truck and locked the doors immediately. His hands trembled badly while he accelerated farther down the winding road, desperate to escape the woods. The radio whispers had grown louder and almost sounded excited. The smell reached him before he noticed the abandoned vehicles hidden among the trees. Dozens of cars sat half-buried in mud and vines beyond the roadside ditch. Some looked decades old, while others appeared almost brand new beneath layers of dirt. Caleb slowed beside a black SUV whose headlights still glowed faintly through the rain. The driver's door hung open while deep claw marks covered the metal panels. Something slowly moved behind the fogged rear window. A pale face suddenly pressed against the glass from inside the SUV. Its hollow eyes stared directly at Caleb, without blinking once. Before he could react, every abandoned vehicle around him flashed their headlights on simultaneously. Blinding beams illuminated the entire forest, while weak engines groaned somewhere among the wrecked cars. Caleb shielded his eyes in terror, while long, distorted car horns echoed through the darkness. The forest suddenly felt awake and aware of him. The headlights flickered in uneven patterns like silent signals passed through the trees. Caleb slammed his foot onto the accelerator and sped away from the ditch. Panic clawed violently through his chest. The road twisted deeper into the woods until the abandoned vehicles disappeared behind him. Rain battered the windshield hard enough to blur his vision, almost completely. Then a faint yellow light appeared ahead through the fog. An old ranger station stood beside the road, surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence. Several windows had been boarded shut from the inside, while the wooden walls sagged with age. A weathered sign near the entrance read, "Blackwood Fire Watch." Caleb hesitated before stepping out of the truck carrying a flashlight. The forest surrounding the station felt unnaturally silent, as though every living creature had vanished. Even the rain sounded muffled beneath the towering trees. The station door creaked open with almost no resistance. Dust and mildew filled the air while papers littered the stained floor inside. Caleb swept the flashlight across the room and froze. Dozens of missing person posters covered the far wall from floor to ceiling. Families, truck drivers, tourists, and teenagers stared outward from faded photographs. Every poster carried the same words beneath the pictures. Last seen, near highway rest stop. Some posters looked nearly 50 years old, while others had been printed only months earlier. Caleb's stomach tightened when he recognized one familiar face among them. The woman from the rest stop stared back at him from a newspaper clipping dated 1998. According to the article, she had disappeared during a thunderstorm after stopping along the interstate. Caleb backed away slowly, while fear crawled through his chest. A loud crash suddenly echoed deeper inside the station. He followed the sound down a narrow hallway lined with rusted filing cabinets and water stains. At the end of the corridor, an old television glowed faintly beside stacks of dusty videotapes. The screen suddenly flickered to life. Black and white security footage showed the same rest stop parking lot during different years. Travelers climbed nervously into their vehicles before driving toward the same forest road. Every recording ended the exact same way. Headlights vanished into darkness before the screens dissolved into static. Then the final videotape began playing by itself. A terrified man stumbled before the camera, screaming that the forest copied human voices to lure travelers deeper between the trees. Shadowy figures slowly appeared behind him, while dozens of distorted whispers filled the room. "Stay on the route," the voices murmured together, moments before the footage abruptly ended. The television exploded into violent static. Caleb backed away while his flashlight trembled badly in his hands. Somewhere outside, something heavy moved through the wet forest surrounding the ranger station. A low scraping sound dragged across the roof overhead. Dust drifted from the ceiling, while old beams groaned under shifting weight. Caleb held his breath as slow footsteps circled directly above him. Then the station light suddenly died. Complete darkness swallowed the hallway, except for pale television static flickering across the walls. Caleb heard faint breathing nearby that definitely did not belong to him. He slowly turned his flashlight toward the corridor entrance. Tall, shadow-like figures stood motionless at the far end of the hallway. Their bodies looked unnaturally thin beneath dripping darkness, while hollow white eyes reflected the flashlight beam. Caleb nearly dropped the light in terror. The creatures twitched violently the moment the beam touched them. Their heads tilted at impossible angles, while overlapping whispers spilled from their mouths in broken fragments. Every voice sounded stolen from different people. Caleb bolted toward the station entrance as the shadows rushed after him. Their movements looked jerking and unnatural, like puppets dragged across the floor by invisible strings. The whispers quickly became frantic, screaming voices begging him not to leave. He burst outside into freezing rain and sprinted toward the truck. Dark shapes moved constantly between the trees, keeping pace beside him through the undergrowth. Some crawled on all fours, while others hung motionless from branches overhead. Caleb slammed the truck door shut and locked it, just as one shadow figure reached the window. Black liquid streamed from its skin like melting tar, while pale eyes stared inches from his face. Then it spoke, using the exact voice of Caleb's dead father. "You shouldn't have come here, son," the creature whispered softly through the glass. Caleb froze completely while terror crushed the air from his lungs. His father had died nearly 10 years earlier. The GPS screen suddenly flared bright red beside the steering wheel. Strange coordinates flashed repeatedly, alongside the same circular symbol carved into the sign at the rest stop. Caleb remembered an old story his grandfather once told him. According to local legends, certain forests trapped the souls of lost travelers and fed on fear until nothing human remained. The symbol represented a doorway where the living could wander into something ancient hidden beneath the trees. Caleb realized the rest stop itself might not even be real. The shadow figures slowly surrounded the truck, while rain hammered the roof like fists. Dozens of stolen voices whispered Caleb's name softly through the darkness outside. Some sounded like frightened children, while others carried weak, elderly cries. Panic threatened to overwhelm him completely, while the creatures circled closer around the truck. Then he remembered the woman's warning from the rest stop about the GPS leading travelers into the forest forever. The device crackled with static before speaking again. "Remain on the current route," the cold mechanical voice calmly ordered. The twisted symbol on the screen slowly spun like something alive beneath shattered glass. One of the creatures slammed violently against the passenger window. Cracks spread across the glass, while black liquid dripped from the figure's face. More whispers joined together outside, until every voice repeated the same sentence in perfect unison. "Stay on the route." The words echoed through the truck cabin, until Caleb could barely think clearly anymore. He ripped the GPS from the dashboard and stared at the glowing display in horror. The map no longer showed roads, only the expanding symbol. Another heavy impact shook the truck hard enough to rock it sideways. Pale hands pressed against every window, leaving streaks of black water behind. Caleb realized the creatures were no longer trying to scare him. They were preparing to drag him out. With a desperate scream, Caleb smashed the GPS against the steering wheel. The screen cracked but continued glowing bright red beneath shattered glass. Outside, the whispering instantly turned furious. The creatures shrieked so loudly the truck doors rattled violently. Caleb struck the GPS again and again until sparks exploded across the dashboard. The moment the device finally died, absolute silence swallowed the forest. Then the trees began moving. The endless wall of pines slowly shifted apart ahead of the truck, as though invisible hands were pulling them back. A narrow road appeared through the darkness, leading toward faint morning light far away beyond the forest. The shadow figures suddenly recoiled, screaming in distorted rage. Caleb wasted no time pressing the accelerator to the floor. The truck raced down the newly revealed road, while the creatures chased wildly through the trees beside him. Their twisted bodies slammed against branches and mud, while dawn slowly brightened ahead. Minutes later, the forest abruptly ended at the edge of the interstate highway. Warm sunrise spilled across the empty road, while birds sang softly in the distance. Caleb looked back one final time. The forest road behind him had completely vanished. He drove for nearly an hour before finally stopping at a crowded truck station outside a small town. Ordinary sounds of traffic and conversation felt unreal after the nightmare he had survived. Caleb sat motionless behind the wheel while his hands continued shaking. When he finally stepped outside, thick mud still coated the sides of his truck. Long black streaks covered the windows like fingerprints burned permanently into the glass. No matter how hard he later tried cleaning them, faint marks always remained. Caleb eventually reported the ranger station and forest road to local authorities. Search crews found no exit ramp, no ranger station, and no evidence of abandoned vehicles anywhere along the highway. According to official state maps, Blackwood Forest did not exist. The missing person photographs haunted Caleb for weeks afterward. Sometimes he woke in darkness, hearing dozens of whispers repeating his name beyond the bedroom walls. During storms, he occasionally smelled wet soil and rotting pine drifting through the house. 3 weeks later, another thunderstorm rolled across the same lonely stretch of interstate after midnight. A tired traveler pulled into a dimly lit rest stop hidden beside towering black pines, while rain hammered the roof overhead. Inside their car, the GPS screen flickered softly before a calm mechanical voice whispered, "Route recalculating."